I spent my Labor Day taking some time to clean the studio. I also made some new white curtains for my little sewing alcove. They just kind of disappear. They're just plain white, but it was a task that I was looking forward to getting done. So today we're going to be talking about putting borders on a quilt, and this block of the month is one of the videos that I started about 25 videos ago. So we're going to get started measuring the quilt and just walking through how to put on a simple basic border. This block of the month, which is called Winter Wonderland, is our 2020 block of the month. It's actually one of 3 Christmas block of the months. We have this Winter Wonderland. There's also a Christmas tree skirt and a second quilt in the series. All of them are still available. This is one of the first videos that I did for Urban Elements, was getting these blocks started. And today we're going to talk about measuring the quilt for the borders. It's just going to be a simple inner border and an outer border. And one of the things that I will say is it's really important to make sure that your quilt top is freshly ironed, because even a slightly wrinkled quilt top could give you an error in measuring up to 3/4 of an inch, depending on how wrinkled it is. So I freshly pressed this one, and we're going to zoom in and get started on measuring this quilt for a basic border. Whenever I go about measuring for a border on a quilt, what I want to do is find the center of the quilt and measure from that point for the 2 sides, and then measure the other way in the center for the 2 opposite sides of the border. And the reason I do that is because the center should give you a more accurate measurement for what the correct size of the border should be. Sometimes the corners of the quilt will flare out a little bit because of our piecing or ironing or handling, and measuring at those points would give you an inaccurate measurement, and you might have a border that's just a little bit too long, and that would cause what I like to call lettuce borders, because they ruffle like a lettuce leaf. So this is my center seam on the vertical line, so I'm going to use my measure right on that line and measure out what the length of the center is, and in this case it's 53 inches. So I've cut my 2 strips for my inner border at 53 inches, and I'm going to go ahead and pin those in place and pop over to the sewing machine and get those sewn on. And as far as putting borders on your quilt, you really get to choose to bring out the colors that you like in the quilt and really help it to blend into the the environment in which the quilt is going to live. Or you could just pick colors that you like, or just pick colors that are closely related to what's already in the quilt. I mean, I wouldn't choose anything crazy just because it matched my room, but I really love this periwinkle color, so that's why I chose this. So I'm going to get these pinned in place and meet you over at the sewing machine. I also want to mention before I get to the sewing machine that since I know that this strip is the exact size that the quilt border should be, what I want to do is line that up with the very edge of the quilt and start pinning one way, but not just go all the way to the end. I want to pin both edges coming towards the center. So I'll do a couple pins here, and then I'll move to the other end and make sure that that border is right on the very corner. And then I can stretch out the quilt a little bit and make sure that the center is right where it needs to be. So if there's any easing, I can do that while I'm pinning it. If you just pin in one direction, you might get to the end and be either too short or too long. Even though we know that this strip is exactly the size that it should be, just in handling the fabric we could distort it, or the quilt. So it's important to start with both ends and work towards the center. Okay, I have my 1/4 inch foot on the machine, and my strip is cut 1.5 inches. So when I'm finished with this inner border, it will be 1 inch. And I'm going to go ahead and start sewing. I'm going to do just one little bit of back stitching once I get a few stitches in, just to make sure that that seam is tight. And I have my little weight here just to help the quilt from flying off. I also have my thin strip on top of the quilt, so I can keep an eye on that. Whenever I'm sewing a small piece and a big piece, I like to have the small piece on top if I can, so I can keep an eye on what's happening with it. Peach fuzz. I'm surprised there's any fuzz in my studio today because I spent most of the weekend cleaning it. I can't believe how messy this room gets. And there's only me in here, so I can't blame anybody else but me. Me and the little granddaddy long-legged spiders that seem to inhabit my room. I'm going to finish these 2 seams and then I'll meet you. Now that I have my 2 side strips on, I'm going to go ahead and just iron them from the top, because they always say that sets the seam and helps give you a crisper seam allowance. Another thing I will tell you is the reason why I did the 2 long sides first. This particular quilt without the border was 53 inches. In my case, the fabric that I had for the inner border was 54 inches. So if I had done the top and bottom first, when I went to put the 2 sides on, my piece wouldn't have been long enough and I would have had to have a seam in it. Now that would have been okay, but if I did it the other way first, then I wouldn't have had a seam, and I like no seams better if I can get that. So then I will just go ahead and pull the top inner border back and give that a press with the iron really coming up against the edge of that fabric, so I get a nice crisp edge. That's also one of the reasons why I like batik, because the batik gives you such a crisp sewing point and it irons so beautifully. So when I can, that's why I like to use batik, but I don't always use batik. One of the reasons why I do like it. And I don't know why this This particular inner border periwinkle color, I'm in love with it. When I saw it at the fabric store, I knew that I had to buy some. Wasn't even sure yet what I was going to use it for. So I did not take this to match it exactly, but I do love it. Now that we have the two side borders on, I can go ahead back to the middle. And this particular quilt does not have a center seam that goes completely across, so I'm just going to choose one and follow a straight line. And again, I'm going to measure across the middle of the quilt. And I'm going to find the measurement, which is 44 1/4 in this case. And I'm going to go ahead and cut my two strips and get those put on pinned in place for the top and bottom. But now that these inner borders are on the side, the seam allowance for the width of it is already built in. So I just have to cut the strips exactly the same size as the center of the quilt and get those pinned in place. And then we can move on to sewing those down and working on the outer border. Okay, I'm on to my last two inner borders. Just have to get that positioned and whip my pen out. I think it's funny sometimes how a fabric can make you so happy. I swear I don't know what it is about that periwinkle fabric, but it makes me smile just looking at it. Another thing I really like about batiks, well, there's really no wrong side of any fabric. I mean, sometimes the back of a regular fabric can give you a completely different look while still looking correct. But the batiks have no right and wrong side, really, so for the most part it really saves me from putting something on backwards. The only time that is not the case is when I'm sewing strips of binding together that already have seams in it, and sometimes you forget to check which is the top on that. I have had to rip apart some of my binding before. And just for the record, making binding is okay, but hand sewing binding is not my favorite. It's probably my least favorite quilting chore. Buying fabric, probably my favorite. Even the fabric selection is one of my favorites. But like anything, you kind of have to be in the mood. Sometimes as I'm making these tops, I wonder how long I think I'm going to live to get them all quilted, especially lately. I've been starting a lot of projects and getting them 3/4 of the way to the finish line and not quite making it all the way to the binding process or even quilted. So we'll finish this seam and we'll meet you back at the ironing station. When I was working on the inner border for this piece, I had to put the long sides on first because the length of my fabric was almost exactly the length of the quilt without the border. So I had to do those first and then put on the top and bottom. And then I chose this fabric, which is going to be my outer border. And the reason I chose this was because of these elements in here to me that look like snowflakes. So I really liked the snowflake element of it. Some people might see flowers or something else. I see snowflakes. But I want to keep this diagonal line consistent throughout the border of the quilt. And as you can see, the fabric that I have is almost exactly the perfect size for the width of this quilt with the inner border on it. So in this case, rather than doing the two sides first, I'm going to have to do the top and bottom first so that I have the width that I need to do this. Also, I'm going to use cornerstones. The cornerstones are going to be the same fabric that I used for my background. I also might include one applique in the four corners, which probably will be a snowflake on my cornerstone. But I'm going to go ahead and measure the quilt again from the center to get my two strips, and then I'll go ahead and do the top and bottom, and then we'll go ahead and get these pinned in place, and I'll show you what those look like. I have my top and bottom strip cut, and in this case I'm going to sew one on and then come back and iron it and pin it in place just to make absolutely sure that I get the directionality of my diagonal line correct. So it would be easy for me to pin them both and think that I had them right, but I've been sewing with myself long enough to know that I would get that wrong. So I'm going to do one at a time, get them sewn, and come back to the ironing board. I hope this will make sense. I have my top border sewn onto the inner border, and I have my diagonal lines going in this direction. I have the quilt folded back on top of itself, so this is the bottom inner border, and I'm going to lay my strip down. It's not diagonal, but the diagonal design, so that it's going in the same direction. So when I flip it over to pin it, I know I'm pinning this in the right direction. I have to do that for myself because I know what my sewing is like. Miracle of miracles, I have my top and bottom border on, and they have the diagonal line in the correct position, so yay for me. The next thing I'm going to do is cut the two lengths I need for the side borders, and I'm going to add cornerstones in the four corners of the quilt. The cornerstones are going to be the same fabric as the background. My strips that I cut were 5.5 inches wide this way on both sides, so my cornerstones need to be 5.5 inches square. I'm going to cut 4 of those 5.5 inches square, and then the length of the border is going to be the exact same length that this inner border was, and it's going to be the exact same length as the quilt was when I had the top and bottom inner border on. If you didn't have that written down, one way that you can measure it again is by measuring all the way from the very edge of the fabric of the inner border all the way across the center to the edge of the inner border again. That is already will include the 1/4 inch seam allowance at the top and bottom that you would also need for the two sides. So again, the length is going to be the same length as my inner border was because we're using cornerstones. So I'm going to get those cut and get the cornerstones ready, and we'll go ahead and show you how we put those. I had told you that I had cut the outer border the same length as I had cut this inner border, and that would have been true if I had put that on first or second and it was the full length of the piece. But in fact, I needed to add the amount of the inner border for the top and bottom. So I'm glad I double measured that. That is why I have to measure, and do things one step at a time. So I measured from this top piece of the inner border all the way down to the very bottom piece. And I know that when I add my cornerstone on, that that'll be the exact size, because this had the piece sewn onto it, this will have the piece sewn onto it, and they'll both have used a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I have this laid out so that the diagonal lines will go across the quilt in the same direction, and I'm going to place my 2 pieces on and get those sewn in place and pin one of them just to show you that I did, in the end, measure correctly. When I had ironed the outer border for the top and bottom, I had ironed the seam allowance towards the darker fabric. And in order for these to nest, when I iron this piece also, I want to iron that towards the darker fabric. And that way when I position those, they will really nest nicely. So I want to repeat that process. Just to make sure I'm doing it right, I'm doing it from the back. But that way when I lay this piece in position, it will be nested with that seam. It'll make it a lot easier to match up. And also that's going to be what I match first, is this seam for both the top and bottom. I'm going to put a pin right through there on both ends, and then pin all the way through the middle and get those ready to sew. Well, we got it finished. I have all 4 borders on. My diagonal line is running in the correct position for all 4 sides. The cornerstones have really crisp points, so in the end we did get that measured correctly. And I have a place in the 4 corners if I want to add another applique like a snowflake, or if I just want to leave it alone. I know sometimes the designers roll their eyes at me when I pick fabric or add an extra add-on, but I love snowflakes. And winter is my favorite time of year. Christmas is my favorite holiday. So the next thing that will happen with this is we need to get it quilted, and probably at some point we'll talk about choosing a quilting design for this quilt and for other quilts, just to give you an idea how to choose a panto. So I hope you enjoyed this block of the month. We still have these available, so if you love the block of the month and you didn't sign up, it's not too late. Go ahead and log on to the website www.urbanelements.com and look up Winter Wonderland.